Welcome everybody. Welcome to our 7th of 7 seminars in our summer series. Seemed like a good idea in April, and we've done 7, so I think that's fantastic. And as an extra special treat today, at the end of today's seminar, we'll be announcing, you'll be the first to hear, our autumn lineup for our autumn series. We've got 4 seminars booked up for September, October, November, December, and we'll be sharing those with you at the end of this seminar. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Katharine. Katharine works at the Raspberry Pi Foundation. She works on the Gender Balance in Computing programme, and she's going to talk to us today about gender balance in computing and what the research says. And over to you.
So thank you for that lovely welcome, Sue, and thank you for inviting me along to present today. I'm excited to be connecting with everybody. And so this topic of this presentation is a summary of some key research into promoting gender equity in computing. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the end as well about how this research has informed a project that we're running in schools in England, which is called Gender Balance in Computing. So just as an overview, what we're going to cover, I'm going to give you some context of how things work in England for those who aren't familiar with that. We'll look at a couple of metaphors which are used quite frequently in the literature to talk about gender balance in computing. I'm then going to move on to some key themes and some deep dives into some things a little bit more in depth. And right at the end, we'll talk about where next, what our particular programme is going to be looking at, and also a couple of themes in the literature which may inform wider research in the field. The thing that I'm not going to cover today is why it's important that girls study computing. That is pretty much a given and an assumption amongst us all today. There are many reasons why girls should study computing, and that could be a whole topic of a seminar in itself. But let's just say, suffice to say, computing is pervasive in our everyday world. We use it for so many different things, and diversity in the creation and application of computer programs can only be a good thing in terms of the people that it serves and the lack of bias then that it gives. So in terms of our English education system then, this is how it works for us. I've drawn a quick diagram on here. You can see we start with R, which is for reception, and those are our year groups in bold on the first row of those tables, and then the ages of the children are underneath as well. So children start primary phase in reception, they go all the way up until year 6. They then transfer on to the secondary phase of education, which is years 7 to 11. And the important thing that happens then is in year 9 when they make subject choices. So up until then, they're studying all the different subjects in the curriculum. And then in year 9, they have to decide what they want to specialise on a little bit more. They then take those qualifications in years 10 and 11. At the end of year 11, that's when the exams take place. Post 16, we have a system where all young people aged 16 to 18 have to be in education, employment or training. And then from 18 plus, it's on into the big wide world of life, into university, employment, or whatever else people might like to do. And in terms of where computing fits into this, you can see the cells that are shaded in green. These are the years where computing is taught. So computing is a mandatory subject in our national curriculum. It covers 3 different strands. We have computer science, digital literacy, and information technology within that subject. And then at the year 9 subject choice point, we have options where students can choose academic qualifications in computer science or more vocational certificates and diplomas, which cover more of the digital literacy and information technology. And then that goes on into the post-16 as well. So the more academic qualifications are computer science A-level and then a degree in computer science. We've been running this system in England. It was introduced between 2014 and 2016. So we've got some data now about what's happening. And you can see from the table that girls aren't currently represented well at all in GCSE and A-level in England. So Last year, for example, 21.4% of the students who were entered for GCSE computer science were girls, and 13.2% entered for A-level were girls. What you'll notice from year on year is the positive is that the number of girls taking computer science is increasing slowly, and with that as well, the proportion of girls taking computer science is slowly increasing also. But obviously there's some work to do with that. Computer science has one of the highest gender imbalances across all the subjects studied for formal qualifications in England. And that kind of carries on really into undergraduate degrees as well. So girls aren't currently represented well in, say, engineering or computer sciences. And this is particularly stark when you compare it with things like physical sciences and mathematical sciences as well. Interestingly, this isn't a global phenomenon. So there are countries which do have a better gender balance. Countries such as India and Malaysia tell a different story, for example. But here in this country, we have this kind of pipeline of formal qualifications, in this case at ages 16, 18 and 21. And girls really aren't represented well in that pipeline at all. Thinking about pipelines, that's one of the key ways that computing education researchers frame their work into gender balance. So let's have a look at this kind of metaphor of pipelines right now. So the literature in gender balance starts with puzzles, starts with questions. It's almost surprising in a way that more girls don't study computing. Especially if you're a girl that studied computing yourself, you might wonder, well, why aren't more people taking this subject? And some of the earliest research has taken more of an abductive approach to this, thinking about using metaphors to frame the situation and then looking for best fit solutions to describe what's happening in terms of gender balance as a phenomenon. It's important to think about what these are, because then future studies go on and build on the initial studies. And they kind of take obviously the conclusions and the hypotheses and then sort of try and test these out. So the first metaphor that comes up again and again in the literature is the idea of this incredible shrinking pipeline, or a leaky pipeline as it's often known as well. And this does describe this sort of like passing through the stages of education with fewer and fewer girls choosing computer science. Research which references this metaphor, it often creates interventions which are focused on retaining girls as they pass through each of the stages, looking at success outcomes in terms of the quantitative retention figures. Another key metaphor is unlocking the clubhouse, and this is the title of a seminal work by Margolis and Fisher, and they refer to computing as a kind of clubhouse where only certain people are allowed. And they look at what can be done to unlock that clubhouse and let more people in. It's a really interesting sort of work where they did a lot of research in terms of interviews with sort of universities, students, high schools in the States, and came up with a really sort of interesting sort of package of interventions that they used within their university. And then a third metaphor which has been used more recently is the idea of a social turn. And this phrase has actually been used across lots of different disciplines to situate learning. The social turn talks about learning being socially and creatively important. And Caffey and Burke specifically applied it to computing, thinking about turning away from computing as being an individual solitary subject towards something that could be more collaborative. So I've looked at really two key questions which we're going to explore throughout the rest of the presentation. Thinking about what barriers prevent girls' participation in computing and what interventions can support those girls to overcome those barriers and actually choose computing qualifications and careers. One of the things that we're very aware of in computer science education research is that we have such a small evidence base. And so it's often also useful to look at wider STEM subjects as well and draw on findings and identify what can be applied or potentially applied across to computing. we're still learning how to effectively teach computing concepts and practices, right? And at the same time, we're kind of figuring out any unintended effects of the pedagogies that we're using as well, which could be things like gender bias. So this is a really kind of a new field with lots of questions to ask. I'm going to stop here a minute and ask a very deep question. And I want you to think about this rhetorically in your heads. I'm not going to ask anybody to answer this out loud, but let's just pause for a moment and let's think, well, why should schools teach computing? And if someone were to ask you that question, or if someone were to ask you, what does computer science education research add value-wise to the field of research? I wonder what you would say. I'm going to suggest an answer to the question. I'm going to suggest that we should teach computing because it helps students to define problems and solve them with technology. And also, in terms of what our curriculum says in England, we have this fantastic statement that the Department for Education put right at the top of our computing curriculum, which says a high quality computing education equips pupils to use computational thinking and creativity to understand and change the world. Wow, I mean, that's a big ask, right? Now, I mentioned earlier that computing in our curriculum covers these three strands: computer science, information technology, and digital literacy. And it's computer science which features in the formal qualifications, and it's also computer science which is considered generally one of the hardest and most difficult areas to learn. So it seems wise for the rest of this presentation to focus our thoughts on computer science concepts and skills specifically. What we do know in terms of attainment in computer science is that girls are likely to attain well when they do take computer science. Analysis has been done of our GCSE subject results, and girls are more likely to get high grades than boys are in the subject when they do take it, and that they do tend to outperform boys at A level as well. What's interesting though is that they do tend to underperform compared with other subjects, and there could be many different reasons for this, but generally we know that computer science is an area that girls could do well in and can do well in. So whereas attainment relates to the standards that exam results show, we think more about achievement as learning gains made by a pupil. And we think more about their progress in a subject, but then what does that actually mean in terms of computing? And this is where the social turn comes back in, because this is where it's a concept that shifts the goals of learning. So instead of computer programming being about writing code, although writing efficient, working, accurate code does remain important, the focus then comes into the idea of creating applications. So learners have the opportunity to create applications which have meaning to them. It could be games or stories or animations or apps. And then secondly, rather than programming being about individual tools, it becomes about communities. And it becomes about facilitating that collaboration of working together in the subject. And then the third part of the social turn, and this is how it's framed by Caffey and Burke in their paper on this subject, is that instead of composing from scratch, they talk about remixing and building on the work of others as well. And obviously this kind of pedagogy, in terms of making meaningful digital artifacts which can be displayed to others, which can be viewed by others, that's kind of aligning quite heavily with Seymour Papert's theory of constructionism. And we're leaning here towards a more socio-cultural learning perspective. Now, feeling a sense of achievement in computer science can be highly subjective, and it does relate to a sense of self-efficacy in the subject, especially when it comes to learning how to program. And so this idea of moving from individual tools to collaboration is something that's been looked at in some depth already in STEM subjects. So, for example, there's been studies done by Werner and Denning, looking at collaborative pedagogies in computer programming. They've found that this can help with middle school girls in terms of increasing both their confidence and their knowledge. And then there's also some work being done in physics, looking at how peer instruction can help students understand difficult concepts in a way that involves interactive engagement and sort of peer discussion. And this has also been found to close the gender gap between male and female test scores. So it seems to be that there is some sort of value in looking more at collaborative approaches to teaching programming. But as well as how we teach, we have to think what we teach as well. And here we go. I'm going to ask you another big question now. Where is computing relevant in society? And again, just have a think about this in your heads for a minute. I am confident that if we went around this hangout and asked for some different answers, we would get a wide variety. I'm confident that there would be things like engineering, app creation, software development mentioned. Maybe even we'd sort of push out a little bit further and look at things like biology or fashion or healthcare. Basically, I'm sure that between us we have many different areas where we know computing's relevant in society. And again, this links back to this idea of the social turn, where programming turns from being about writing code to being about creating applications. So this is where we start to think about real world contexts for computing, because obviously computing can seem like a very theoretical subject, especially for learners. Let's take, for example, a bubble sort algorithm. So bubble sort algorithms take a set of values and rearrange them in order, say, for example, from lowest to highest. And it's a common topic for learners as they start to think about how algorithms are used to sort data. And in teaching how it works, there's lots of theory there. There's lots to talk about the mechanics of how that works. You can take it as an unplugged application and just try it out with a set of values. You can write a computer program to make it work. You can think about the efficiency of how the sort works, or in the bubble sort's case, sort of inefficiency, I guess. But then there's the other side of it as well, is the application, is what data are you actually sorting and how useful is it? I've seen the bubble sort algorithm taught with a variety of data sets, things like playing card values, ages, sizes of sports balls, heights. But the one that really stood out for me was the number of fish eaten by dolphins in an aquarium. And this set of data was going to be ordered from lowest to highest, so that it could be used in a calculation to find the mean and the mode of fish, so that people knew how much fish to order. And suddenly that brought that sort of concept to life. Suddenly you start to see about, if you learn these things, how can they be applied in the real world? And research tells us this contextual information is often very important for female students. It can be in the form of realistic data sets, like the example that we've just talked about. It could be in things like the choice of contexts. So it could be giving learners a choice of different situations that they could use the same programming concepts in. Or it could even be giving them the agency to make their own choice, finding a problem that matters to them and solving it. There are a number of different research studies that have started to look into this and find out what the impact of solving real world problems has with girls. The one I've picked out is one that was done by Guzdial and Elliott in 2006. And they were on a media computation course, and they were linking films into the course to add context to the work that they were doing. They actually make a really interesting argument as well, that it's almost impossible to find a truly authentic real world situation, but the role of educators is to imagineer as real world and as an authentic situation as you can. But basically, the outcomes of that study were to do with female students having more positive attitudes towards the subject that they can link to real world problems. And obviously, when we think about the attitudes that pupils have towards subjects, we can sort of hypothesize that they are then more likely to consider it as a subject choice. I'm going to ask the third of three big questions now, so prepare your mental selves. Who is computing for? Most of the literature on gender balance in computing will repeatedly focus on why girls will think that computing is not a subject for them. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. There's plenty of historical evidence around the rise of the home computer in the 1980s, how that was marketed at boys and men, sort of making it seem like a male sort of hobby. And the literature sort of draws that out and shows how societal perceptions sort of grew that computing was a subject for boys and men. The problem with this is that once women became a minority group in the computing workforce, it's kind of created this repetitive cycle of female inequity. Girls don't see themselves represented in the field, so they aren't motivated to pursue it, which then perpetuates the lack of representation and continues the perception that girls don't belong in computing. And this sense of belonging is really, really important. And here we can draw on something called self-determination theory. Self-determination theory suggests that students have three basic needs in order to sustain motivation and persistence in any given subject. So we have competency, which is the need to feel effective in a subject, and that's kind of linked to the idea of mastery. We have autonomy, which is the need to feel in control of one's choices and one's destiny. And then we have relatedness. And relatedness is the need to feel connected and belonging with others. And there's a really interesting study that was done and published last year, which has found that relatedness is the most important of these three conditions for girls' motivation to study computing. This was a study done with female high school computing students. They were aged 14 to 18. And there was really interesting that came out as the most important of the three. It was also a significant predictor of girls' motivation. So the more they felt they belonged in the subject, the more they were likely to want to continue and persist in studying it. We know that computing has quite a stereotyped image of being quite a geeky subject, and girls might avoid computer science courses because the current stereotypes in the field signal to them that they don't belong. So interventions that dismantle these stereotypes can be of value. And one of the ways of breaking this cycle is to call out existing representation of female computing students or women in computing careers as role models for the next generation. The use of role models is generally influenced by one of two schools of thought on role model theory. The first is to emphasize behaviors, attitudes, and emotional reactions, observing and modeling those in other people, and then replicating them yourself. And then more recently, there's a role model sort of pattern around cultural values, which say that aspirations and achievements are important, and that we need to see women in high ranking jobs and sort of women who've achieved great things in the field of computing too, so we can emulate them. Role model theory argues that there is a gender difference in how role models are used. And for women, the self-perceived likeness of the role model to themselves is significantly related to their self-esteem. So high achieving role models may actually provide the opposite effect from what was intended and deter girls from emulating the individual because they feel that those achievements are too far out of reach. But on the other hand, if girls select role models based around one perceived likeness, that they may choose friends and family who are quite close to their circle, and then they might not see any computing role models at all. So thinking about role models then, it's important to think about that Goldilocks size of role model, I suppose, where you can see the aspirational people, but you can also see people who are at the next level of where you want to get to. I got at the when I share the slides at the end, I've got a sort of a slide which compares 3 different role model studies, which I haven't got time to go into today, but it will be there at the end with the slides if you want to have a look at it. In terms of a couple of other areas where we think there may be barriers, but we need to find more about, parental support is a big plays a big part in children's choices of subjects. There's a study by Denner called What Predicts Middle School Girls' Interest in Computing, and it looks at a number of different factors. One of those is parental support. And she talks about the emotional support that parents provide to be aspirational and to aim high. And she also notes that the more support that parents give for a subject, the higher a girl is likely to perceive that subject as relevant, which is really interesting. So we can see from the literature that parental understanding and support affects attitudes towards the subject, and there's definitely more to find out about that. And then another area which we really haven't looked at in much depth in the literature yet as a community is around non-formal learning. So the Raspberry Pi Foundation runs 2 non-formal extracurricular programs of coding clubs, and girls are better represented in these activities. At Coder Dojos in 2017, 33% of attendees were girls. 40% of children at code clubs in 2018 were girls. And there seems to be some potential here to connect non-formal learning experiences with formal learning choices. And we're just really showing girls how their experiences can contribute towards their goals. So I've kind of summarised where we've got to with a table of barriers and suggested interventions to overcome them. Thinking about the individuality and the collaborative nature of learning. Thinking about where we focus the relevance of computing as a subject. Thinking about how we can show that girls and women belong in computing. How we can encourage them to take it as a subject. And how we can use the representation in non-formal learning to leverage some gains in formal learning. And this basically creates the themed interventions that we're running in the Gender Balance in Computing project. So we're looking at various different approaches with a series of randomized controlled trials. It's a 4-year program of work. Obviously, like many of other researchers, our field work is on pause at the moment, but a global pandemic isn't going to stop us making social change. So we're going to be picking things up again soon and working with primary and secondary schools to trial these approaches, which we think have got potential to be scaled nationally if there's enough evidence to show that they're working. If you have interest in this area, you can spread the word. If you have networks of schools in England, that is primary schools and secondary schools, you can direct them to the web page on the slides. If your interest is more general and you'd like to keep up to date with what we're doing, you can sign up for our newsletter. And again, the link is there and it'll be there on the slides when they're circulated afterwards. Very quickly on emerging themes, things that the places where the literature might go next and things where we may need more research in future. We need to think more about inclusivity and thinking about, obviously, gender balance doesn't imply a binary approach to gender. We need to think about non-binary lenses for gender approaches. And also we need to think about looking at the data with an intersectional focus, thinking about the intersections between race and gender, socioeconomic status and gender, ability or disability, and gender too. I think there's lots to still dive deep into in terms of gender balance in computing. Certainly in England, the figures that we saw at the start show that there is definitely a need for research to identify interventions which really will help girls consider that computing is a subject for them. So I'm very grateful for you to listening, and I'd like to acknowledge all our partner organisations as well for the thanks and support that they're giving us on the Gender Balancing Computing project. And yeah, so I'm going to hand back to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Katharine. Should we do a big jazz hands? Big thank you to Katharine for a fantastic talk, perfectly on time. That's brilliant. And I believe that you had some possible discussion ideas for us, Katharine. Did you want to quickly?
I did, yes.
Through those?
Yes. Let me just share my screen again.
While we're getting ready to go into groups. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, ideas that we've talked about here which may merit further discussion is obviously the different teaching approaches that bring out sort of girls' interest in computing. You may want to talk about role models and how you use them or how they could be used. You might want to focus a little bit more on real world problem solving, or you might even have a different idea of something that's inspired you in that presentation, in which case do feel free to have a chat about it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katharine. So I think what we're going to do now is split up into groups, which will be wonderfully managed by Diana in the corner there, or she's in my corner. And then come back in sort of 10 minutes time. When you get into your group, do introduce yourselves to everybody else, and you know who you are, where you come from to start with. We've also note that Zoom's got a whiteboard function. So if one of you wants to use the whiteboard, you can take notes between you, but don't forget just before the end that you need to save it. That's the bit I always forget to say. And then otherwise enjoy your discussion. We'll come back with some questions for Katharine, points around those discussion points. Lots of you may have lots of different experiences to share as well. Thank you. We'll see you in a moment. So thank you very much, Katharine, for the talk. We had great, I think you had great discussions. I'm urging my group to ask lots of questions and raise lots of good points that we had in our group. And so if you've got something to kick us off with, could you either like wave at me or raise your electronic hand in the using the reactions thing. Julie, do you want to start with a point or question for Katharine?
It's a question for Katharine. In your research so far, have you looked at the effect of the gender of the teacher upon the students? Have you looked into the number of girls who take up computing with a male teacher or a female teacher, or the nature of the relationship between the teacher and the student?
So yeah, so the gender and then the relationship, yeah?
Yeah, two things.
Yes, I'm writing things down so I remember to answer the question properly. No, it's not something that I have actually come across in the literature that I've been reading so far. I think because it's a very difficult variable to control for. In terms of if you might have schools where there is only one teacher of computing, especially in primary, but also in some smaller secondary schools as well. So I guess it links most of all to role model theory in terms of the fact that, say, for example, if you had a female computing teacher, it's possible you could conjecture that the girl would see that as a role model and sort of inspire them to follow the subject more. But really, in terms of the actual research and the literature out there isn't anything that I've come across that's drawn any meaningful conclusions. In terms of the relationship with the teacher, again, I think that's something that the literature would sort of cut across all kinds of different subjects, and I've not seen any evidence to suggest that that's any different for STEM subjects than, say, humanities and arts. I think that obviously you can again hypothesize that the better relationship that a student has with a teacher, the more likely they would be to take a subject. But as anybody who's worked in a secondary school knows, when you get to GCSE subject choices, one of the things that they do tell you is don't pick the subject because you like the teacher, because you might not them next year, that kind of thing. So you can see in subject choices that perhaps that's an active thing that's discouraged. from being a variable in the choices. But again, the literature doesn't really go into that, I suspect, because it's quite a difficult one to control for also. But it's a great point, and I think there would be lots of room for sort of informal case studies on that in sort of individual schools.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I'm also picking up questions from the chat, so I just pick one. Randy, do you want to ask your question to Katharine?
Sure. The idea of defining our field and the emphasis on the computing versus programming versus more abstract concepts of computer science, how does that affect gender participation?
Yeah, I mean, I can comment on that in terms of how we define things in England. So our definition very much is computing is the whole subject. And then computer science is a strand within the subject, and then programming is a strand within computer science. And Sue, please do jump in if there's a different interpretation that I'm not getting here. But
so it's hierarchical: computing,
yeah,
computer science, programming. Okay,
that's how we use that terminology here in terms of the differences between the three. I'm aware that that varies between countries and cultures, and yeah.
Yeah, I asked that because, oh, go ahead, sorry.
We talk about computing as being much broader, but I don't think that's necessarily an international thing. I think that's something that we've sort of adopted in England, particularly. I think it's important to know that you can programming is useful in science and engineering and so many other different subjects as well. It's, you know, it's a skill that you can use, or, you know, you might learn it as part of your computing course, but something that you can, and I think that's when Katharine was talking about real world context. I think the sort of relevance area, the kind of area of you know, where you can apply your programming skills is really important.
Thank you.
Oh, Penny, where's Penny? I couldn't see Penny on the screen. Penny, do you want to ask your question to Katharine? Or you're on mute. Those 3 words that we say every day.
Hi, sorry. That's because I haven't done one of these for a little while. I just wondered if there's any research on the impact of parents wanting their child, especially daughters, not to do computer science, because it's seen as a male gender type career. Yeah,
I mean, in terms of specific studies, there's not a lot that I've come across. It's sort of put in the literature as a hypothesis sometimes, that or as a sort of a backdrop, as it were, to the lack of participation of girls, is that maybe parents have an influence because of these social stereotypes where, as I referred to, I think in the talk, sort of computers became seen as something for boys and men, particularly in the 1980s, in the way that they were marketed and targeted. I think parental influences on subject choices and career choices, there's a lot of wider literature on that. I've not sort of looked into it particularly on computing, but it's undoubtedly the fact that parents do have that influence on their children's choices, but it's more around what Dana was suggesting about it being emotional support to follow your dreams and aim high and be who you want to be, rather than specific you should be this or you should be that, because this is a career for a girl and this is a career for a boy. There's undoubtedly somewhere something that will go into this in more depth, but it's not something that I've come across in the field where I've sort of been looking at the moment.
Okay, there's a few other questions coming up. Hayley, did you want to, you've got something about the collaborative nature. Where's Hayley?
Yes, it wasn't my question, but it was from our group, so I thought I'd put it
Or
there.
somebody else, whoever, yeah.
So, no, it was just talking about if we're promoting these collaborative approaches at primary and secondary school, and we know that you work collaboratively once you get to industry, but is there perhaps a bit of a disconnect maybe at the university level where there's less of that collaborative learning and approaches? And do you have any sort of insight into if there's any difference between the university level and the lower levels? That was one of the questions. Yeah, I mean, the collaborative working has a big challenge in terms of sort of assessment, quite clearly, because at some point you have to work individually and be assessed individually on your own work in order to get grades and sort of marks and scores towards qualifications. I think the opportunity here is that a lot of the research is done at university level, and a lot of the research is done in the field because it's a lot easier to access populations to study at university when you're already in a university yourself. I think you referred to the fact as well that, like, so in industry, collaborative working is very much seen as a positive. And I think the links that universities have with employers comes out in the research, because universities want to prepare their students for the world of work. And so sort of where universities have that opportunity to liaise more and closely with employers and find out what the valued skills are, those are the things where universities can use sort of more collaborative environments in some places on their courses. And that might be the continuation then from what they're doing at primary and secondary school.
Richard's got an interesting point in the chat that sort of relates a bit to what we were talking about. We were talking about labelling, how it can be, maybe relates to the parents thing as well. People being labelled as a coder or a programmer as being a negative or a positive thing. I think that is quite challenging. And Richard's asking, Richard, to ask your own question. Sorry, Richard.
Yeah, no, I was fascinated. It really came out through what Katharine was saying. But I see that I'm an engineer, so I'm a professional engineer, and you get not these the short labels, but the really broad ones. You want to be in your career. You start off school. I want to be an engineer, or I want to be a teacher, or I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a scientist. So you have these big terms, these big things. But then computing, there's nothing at the end of computing it itself. If you're doing computing, you become an engineer, you become a scientist, you become a doctor, you become a teacher. But we don't seem to have an end point, and that we need an end point to get people in. And I know that things like STEM with engineering and science and what have you have difficulties as well, not just in terms of gender balance, but also numbers. We're not getting enough through, so we've got to get a lot more. So is there a better positioning of computing, not just as a background subject, but what if you study computing, what are you going to be? What's the one term? I'm going to be you can't say I'm going to be a computer. Well, what am I going to be at the end of it? And kids need something to aim for, something that's generic and something that doesn't change every couple of years. And computing changes like nothing on earth. Every couple of years it changes. So if you haven't got that end point to direct yourself at, then you're really going to struggle. I think that's part of it.
I mean, sorry, Katharine.
No, I was going to say sort of, you can come back in a minute, so I'll give some thoughts, and I'm quite happy for you to also. I think it links to what we were talking about with the relevance of the subject. And obviously we can see that computing can be a useful skill for so many different fields and so many different sort of careers. We can talk specifically about computer programming, for example, and show the relevance of that in terms of solving real world problems. It's almost like, as you say, the lack of the label sometimes does prevent young people from having aspirations in the same way that a label of a doctor or something would do. And I think Celia was saying in the chat that this resonates with mathematics as well, because who actually sets out to be a mathematician apart from, say, a teacher or somebody, or Celia? Celia, I think you're on mute.
I think it's so important what Richard was saying, to have some sort of name, because in the maths community, if you're labelled a mathematician, it means you're working in university. as you know, some sort of mathematician, a professor or whatever at university. In fact, if you look at all the mathematicians who are working in industry, in commerce, in finance, they are not called mathematicians. They are called analysts or something. And so that mathematical role model becomes rather invisible for students. And they only see that the mathematician, you have to be a university. So I think actually, if you can dream up some name for your computing future, that might be really quite good. I don't know what it would be, but it really, I think, is quite important.
Yeah.
So you're not just the academic, you're how all the applications and the uses of computing and programming.
Yeah, there's a challenge for us all there, I think, isn't there? So I'm very aware of the time. I'm just going to hand back to you and see if you wanted to add anything on that question or anything else.
We actually had lots of other questions and points, and I think there's so much to talk about here. I think what we also need to think about is what more research we need. Obviously at Raspberry Pi we're involved in these interventions, but I think there's so much more that can be done. Bob talked about what we understand about in primary schools. There's a lot that we don't understand yet that we need to look into. So I think this is an interesting area that we can all be thinking about, and think about what the research agenda is in this area. But for that, I'd like to just wave hands and clap Katharine again. If you're unmuted, you can thank Katharine again. And then I'm going to Diana, could you share your screen again, and then I can go through the final parts. So thank you very much for coming. It's lovely to see so many people come back again and again every fortnight to these seminars. It's been absolutely lovely. Please do carry on talking on Twitter. Katharine's Twitter handle is there. Please let us know through the feedback form what you think, and do sign up for our research update. And now we have the moving on to the next series of seminars. We're going to announce the speakers that we've got coming up in September. We decided that once we get back to more whatever the new normal is, we're going to go to monthly, so that we're just going to have a seminar on the first Tuesday of every month. The first one we've got is around a big international survey instrument called that an international group have worked on, and the results from that, and it's a survey that we hope to see used quite a lot in the future. So that's a really important piece of research from Monica in US, Keith from Ireland, Rebecca in Adelaide, and Elizabeth in Glasgow. Beginning of October, Shushi Grover, who many of you will have heard of, is coming to talk to us about formative assessment. I'm afraid you got me in the beginning of November because I got bumped from this series. So we talk about Prim in the next series, and David Weintraub, who talks about the difference, the move from blocks to text programming, is going to come to talk to us in December. So I think that's really exciting. I'll share that, and you'll get that in your email and on Twitter and on the web page, so you can sign up for those seminars. But in August we're going to have a break. So thank you so much for participating in these seminars. Thanks to Katharine again for what a lovely and ending one. I know it's summer holidays, so thank you for so many of you for coming along. Really appreciate you coming when it's sunny weather or you're on vacation or whatever. So and look forward to seeing you again all in September.